I moved to practice law in another area. I was promoted to lieutenant commander. But between the time I was promoted and the time I received the official certificate saying I'd been a reasonably good boy and had served well in the Navy, the great change took place in the military where everyone was supposed to have the same rank and the same uniform, as some of you older people, older than 30 or so, might remember. So when they got that document, I was all of a sudden a major, which had nothing to do with the rank I actually had earned, except the equivalent in the Army. So the topic that I'm going to speak on this evening relates to farming among the ancient Celts of Ireland. And what I'm going to try to do is to give you a picture or a window into the old and Irish Celtic community of about 1,500 years ago, or in that general range. Now, to obtain the information or background for this is somewhat difficult, since all of the writing practically of that period was made only after Christianity had come to Ireland. Prior to that time, the Celts had no written language. They had a written language, but it was used only by the Druids, and it was forbidden for others to use it for religious purposes and so on. So as a consequence, the Celts, because they had an oral transmission of language, research is obviously very difficult under those circumstances. But the few centuries following Christianization, or the commencement of Christianization in Ireland, all of the Irish laws were reduced to what they call the old texts, or the law texts. Now, these resources, I suggest, are substantially valid for even a few centuries before the contact with Christianity and subsequent to the contact with Christianity. Because in those times, in that type of culture, there was a very slow change process taking place. So I'm relying basically on the old texts that were prepared by the clergy after the period of Christianity. Now, the Celtic society of that period of time, for the most part, was a farming and a pasturing society. So a good understanding of this society can be achieved by understanding of their farming customs and practices. The texts certainly don't give us a thorough review of their customs and practices in a farming community, or even among the Celts themselves. But they do give us a picture or an image or a window into that, not a complete one, but because the law texts were so thorough, and because the Celtic system of law and government was so complete, almost every aspect of Celtic life can be found in those written texts. Not all of them, of course, survived, but parts of some of the texts survived, and some of them, of course, have survived in full. Now, in addition to the discussion of the general nature of the early Celtic society, I thought it might be helpful if I started from an overview of the peoples who were earlier occupants of the island of Ireland, so that we would all have perhaps a basic concept there of the culture that was already there when the Celts arrived. The humans first came to Ireland about 7,000 BCE. These were Mesolithic people who lived by fishing and hunting and by gathering. The best guesses of the experts is that they probably came in small groups, that there was a relatively small population of them, and that they lived basically by the seashores, by the lakes and by the rivers, and subsisted to some extent at least from the revenue or the sources of the rivers, the fish and shellfish. Somewhere around 4,000 BCE, Neolithic farmers arrived, and they brought some limited cultivation skills. They grew some limited cereals. We're told that they found emmer wheat and barley from some of the sites. They also introduced some of the domestic animals. They introduced cattle, pigs, and sheep. Subsequent to that, about 3000 BCE, the additional Neolithic people arrived who were somewhat more sophisticated, more skilled in farming, and they settled, it appears, mostly in the Boyne Valley of Ireland. They were much more advanced than their predecessors, and archaeologists have now found evidence of very sophisticated dry stone field walls, which are extremely interesting in the manner in which they are prepared. And they've also found some massive passage graves, which indicate a very well-organized culture and society. A long period passed before the next peoples arrived, and that was about 700 years later. And the great contribution of these people at that time were the fact that they were the first that brought metal tools into Ireland. And these, of course, were the first metals used by most civilizations, bronze. They brought bronze farming tools, and obviously these were much more effective and allowed for a more efficient and larger scale farming. Bronze axes, probably more significantly, allowed for the clearing of the forested area of Ireland. Ireland was almost totally forested before the arrival of peoples. So between 700, this is sometime later now, 700 and 300 BC, the Celts had completed their journey across all of northern Europe, settling in places and in general taking control of the various regions they passed through. They arrived in Britain, and about that period of time they started to arrive in Ireland in small numbers. There are some historians who suggest that there was, and linguistic suggestions, that some Celts came to Ireland directly from the continent as well. And as some of you probably know, there's suggestions that they may have come, some of them, from the northwestern part of Italy, where Gauls had already established a culture there. But the evidence does suggest that it was not a massive intrusion. It was a gradual infusion of people into the existing culture, and it's more likely that the Celticization, if that's a good word, Dr. O'Grady, I'm not sure, but it was a gradual process, and the Celtic arrival wasn't a dramatic replacement of existing populations. However, the Celts obviously gained superiority over the peoples that were there based on their warlike experience of moving across Europe, and as well, of course, they had the superiority of arms, the iron swords, because they brought the iron culture to Ireland. Their iron weapons and implements made them, over time, the commanding race of the island. And when they arrived, still most of the land, the arable land, was covered in trees and forests. So they, of course, had the vastly superior tools, and when the amount of land for farming expanded very rapidly after they started arriving under the Celtic axis, iron axis. When the Celts did arrive in Ireland, they brought with them a very well-developed farming culture that was common to many Celtic Western European settlements, which gradually became more and more sophisticated with the passage of time. At the time of the Celts' arrival in Ireland, there was very little written about the Celtic people by other literate societies. There had some contact with the Greeks and some contact, a lot of contact, perhaps too much, with the Romans, but that was somewhat later. Caesar, you'll remember, started approaching Gaul when? Somewhere around 50 BC, before Christ. And at that time, he wrote as well some very fascinating information about the Celts. But the Celts had moved out of what may be Eastern Europe in Russia, in that general region, from a homeland there, and they moved across all of Europe, north of Italy, so to speak, what you know of Italy, what we know of Italy, north of the Alps, until they covered almost all of Europe and were the superior tribes of all of Europe, although they were broken into tribal groups, small and some of them very massive. And some of these tribal groups, the Gauls, were met by Caesar. Now, the early Irish monks and clergy documented, as I say, the rules and laws of the existing society of Ireland when they arrived. Everyone knows, I suspect, that St. Patrick arrived about 430, 435 CE, or after AD, as we used to say, and some period after that, perhaps 30 years or so, before the end of that century, he wrote his very famous commentaries. And in those commentaries, he wrote a lot about Ireland, a fair amount about religious references and so on, but it does contain some aspects in relation to the farming practices. And you will remember, of course, that Patrick, as a captive and slave of a farmer, wrote about his period as a herder of livestock in the woods and in the mountains, where he endured, as he said, snow, rain, and frost. Sounds like our winter. These early Irish monks and clergy, they documented, as I said, the laws, and the farming society that they described was so structured that a review of these laws and rules and the accompanying commentary written by the clerics give us a good insight into the culture of the time. An increasing amount of interdisciplinary academic research by experts is giving us more and more clear picture of the Celts. Not only the Celts in Ireland, but we are getting good literature, historic literature about the development or about the Celtic societies that were in Germany, that were in France, that were in various parts of Europe. And it is an interesting exploration. And I think that I concluded from my reading on the subject that it is an interesting picture, I think, for anyone not only interested in Irish background, but also in the development of human society. Now, to describe early Celtic farming in the brief time that I have, I'm going to focus on a few matters. First of all, on the method of land ownership and use, on some information on the crops that were grown, the farm animals that they had, and the people that you would find in the normal Irish Celtic farm. The farming system was based on a culture that had created something that has been described as kin farming, and that's kin as in relationships. Most of the agricultural land in which kin had some ownership, most of the agricultural land was land in which the kin owned or had some ownership rights or control rights. Ownership was a little more, of property was much more fluid than our understanding of ownership. It was owned, much of it was owned by groups of people. Now, the kin is very difficult to describe, and I haven't found any clear description of what constitutes a kin. And the closest I've come to give you a quick view of it is in some instances a kin were all the descendants of a great-grandfather. Now, I'm sure it expands beyond that and perhaps sometimes even gets smaller than that, but that's a general description to give you a concept. In any event, every Celtic farmer and farm wife knew who was a member of his or her kin, because the kin played a significant role in their whole culture, even outside of the farming function. When kin land is divided on the death of a member, each heir gets a share which he and his family work, often with the assistance of servants and slaves. The farmer can't sell his share of the kin land. without the consent of the rest of the kin. A sale without such consent would be a sale which would be by a contract that we would say the kin could invalidate. On the other hand, if the farmer didn't farm the land properly, or if he did not farm it at all, the kin had the right to appoint a farmer to go in and to farm his land, and he was taken off the land. And obviously part of the reason for this is making sure that all the cultivated land is properly used, but also because everyone in the kin had some personal benefit to achieve by ensuring that all farmland was properly developed. However, if a farmer made a surplus, that is more than would be anticipated in an average crop, if he had a surplus on his farm by good farming or by hard work, then he could use that surplus to buy land which he would own in his own right. So there was some outright ownership of land as well as this kin farming. Now, nevertheless, the kin did acquire some limited rights in this land that he purchased. I said outright, not quite outright. He could not sell the land without the consent of the kin. Even though the proceeds was his, basically, he needed their consent. And the purpose of that, presumably, was to ensure that the kin continued to have the same land and it wasn't sold outside to other kin. If a farmer earned a surplus from other skills that he would have, and many of them do, I see a few farmer relatives in the audience who I know have made some money outside of farming, perhaps not in these categories such as, well, perhaps carpenters, or even poets, or singers. Perhaps some fiddler farmers have made $1 or $2 in the past, in Prince Edward Island. But they could use that money on their own. That was not part of the kin assets. Now, Ireland at this time, in this period, was composed of many kingdoms. Most of them were petty kingdoms, called petty kingdoms, very small kingdoms. We wouldn't classify most of them as kingdoms, but perhaps small counties type of thing in our time. These leaders they all would be, in different measures, subject to some superior king, of which there were classically sometimes 3 and sometimes more in Ireland. The king, when he was appointed a king or became a king, or the petty king, they would, by virtue of their office alone, get a certain quantity of land because of their kingship. And they could assign the use of that land usually to what we would call their civil servants, the chief judge perhaps, the chief poet, the chief physicians or the physicians, enough for these people to make a living more or less from leasing or renting their land. So, but once a king died, his land then passed to the next king. It would be fortunate if it were the major son or one of the sons of that king, but not necessarily. But the land was a function of the kingship, and that was, I guess, the privy purse in later times. Early Irish farming, I should point out that eventually when Christianity came, lots of the land was turned over to the church in a gradual way, of course, until it became one of the major landowners, and the church in turn would rent this land to clients. Early Irish farming was very intensive. Labor, tools were simple, and the work was very hard. A farmer with a small land holding, for example, would not probably have enough tools to do the plowing on his land. And the Irish Celts dealt with that by what we call in English co-agreements between a number of neighborhood farms. Usually 3 or 4 of them together would have enough tools to plow one farm. And then they would all do the farm of another. And I suggest that this arrangement wasn't unlike what I've seen many times as a youngster, particularly on PEI, when farmers would get together and use their equipment and work together, particularly at harvesting season. And I presume that perhaps it still happens to some extent, but perhaps less. Now, the fortunate apparently was the Celtic farmer who was rich enough so that he wouldn't have to suffer the inconvenience and the potential frictions involved in this kind of a co-farming process. One of the ancient Irish texts warned that there are, and I quote, 3 undertakings which would lead to sorrow: co-plowing, vying in feats of strength, and a marriage alliance. Now, the last one I had some difficulty with, but I suspect it refers to an alliance that's not founded on affection or love, but perhaps an arranged marriage for the benefit of the kin. The Celtic farmers also had joint herding arrangements, where a group of farmers would graze their stock together. And again, the laws had many methods of dealing with problems that could arise from this kind of an arrangement. For example, if they're herding a number of sheep together and one of the sheep kills another sheep and no one knows which sheep it did, they applied a principle of Celtic law which says a group is liable for the offense of the one. So what they would do is they'd draw a lot of all the sheep in the field, and the loser would be one sheep, and that sheep would then be given to the owner of the lost sheep. And one can just imagine the frustration of the owner of the guilty sheep. It should be noted that co-farming can't be equated with collective farming. It wasn't a method of co-op or collective farming. Their co-farming, in co-farming, the produce of each holding belongs to the individual farmer, and of course, collective farming, the produce is pooled by all who participate. There were also common rights to non-arable land where you couldn't farm, the forests and other areas, but every member of the kin had some rights in this area of land that belonged to the kin, and this included hunting and fishing, gathering of nuts and berries, and gathering of woods and things of that nature. In this highly regulated kin system, the Celts, there were complex laws for governing the limits and methods of almost every aspect of farming. Now, among the animals that you'd find on the farms, you'd find most of them on the Irish farms of 50 to 150 years ago, and perhaps farming has changed somewhat since then. But by far the most important animals found on the farm were cattle. There is a considerable amount of information in the old Irish texts about the care and the feeding of cattle, and about the laws relating to disputes that arose because of cattle ownership. The impact of cattle in the early society went beyond its agricultural uses or values. In the law texts of the 7th and 8th century, there are frequent references to the use of animals, and cattle in particularly, as currencies of value when assessing fines or tribute or bride prices or fosterage fees or something of that nature. The most significant was expressed in terms of the milch cow. The cow giving milk was of the highest agricultural value, and thus was the basic value standard of a society. In other words, if you had to pay a tribute to somebody, it might be 3 milch cows or something of that nature. The significance of cattle is also emphasized in a perhaps less civilized practice of the Irish Celts, and that was cattle raiding from one kingdom to another. And in addition to the wealth acquisition benefits of cattle raiding, also the successful raiders could have certain bragging rights. And it was a form, I guess, of letting off steam without outright war, and it may have had some benefits. A bull had about half the value of a milch cow. However, a nox would have the same value as a milch cow, but its but the value of almost all of these animals could vary to some extent depending on various factors, obvious reasons. That would consider factors such as breeding, size, age, things of that nature. Horses were also found on many early Irish farms, but they were not as numerous as other farm animals. Small farmer, one with not much land, might not have a horse at all among his stock, but a large farmer was expected to have at least a work pony and a riding horse. The work horses were very small and sturdy. They were used for obvious work animal purposes and for carrying loads. The riding horses were larger, and the breeding of the Irish horses, it seems clear now, was influenced by British Roman horses, and perhaps by Western European sources as well. You can note that by the 8th century, the horseshoe hadn't been introduced into Ireland, and heavy work, such as plowing and hauling very heavy loads, was not performed by horses, but by the ox. And it wasn't until the 13th century that the heavy work horses were introduced into Ireland from the continent to replace the ox. And that was only because at that time they were very well developed as sturdy work horses, and were cheaper and more enduring than the ox. And it won't surprise, I don't think, anyone on the PEI audience, as I have here, particularly Joe Kelly, that the favorite sport of the Irish Celts at all their large gatherings was horse racing. Sheep as well were an important element in the Celtic farming as providers of meat, wool, and milk. In the old texts, interesting factor was that women had a particular association with sheep. There is a provision that in the laws that a woman must first enter upon land that she has acquired accompanied by ewes, where in the same provision relating to man, the man is to be accompanied by horses. I don't know the significance of that. I didn't research that deeply. Sheep were both grazed near the farm and also on the hillsides in common with other herds. It was, they normally sheared sheep only once a year, and the wool naturally was used to make clothing, most of the clothing made by sheep. Sheepskin was used for outer clothing, rugs, bed covers, and to make leather products, the usual. The untanned sheepskin were also used to make parchment. And when I found that factor, there was no explanation why they had parchment and they had no writing culture, at least until the Christian era. So I suspect that the parchment was either made after or was made before, and it may have been used by the Druids for their reckoning and their writing. Or it may have had another use as a very soft and fine leather. The importance of sheep in the Celtic society can be concluded from a fine attached to somebody improperly killing a sheep. The fine was the amount of the commercial value of the sheep multiplied by 20. So obviously it was seen as a serious offense. Goats weren't very common or important to the Celtic culture. They had about 1/10 of the value of the milch cow, but they did provide milk, and they were appreciated. The milk was used for a very sweet cheese that were developed by the Celts, and there was also a milk which translated from the Celtic means, another milk was used to create something that's translated as woman butter. And looking for the explanation of that, I can only conclude that it's a butter superior than cow's milk. Pigs were the preferred source of meat of the early Celts. And the flesh of pigs was the meat of honor at some feast, or many of the feasts, and for royalty. The pig of this period was not at all like the pig that you'll find on your farm. They were small, long-legged, a very hairy animal, quite unlike the modern pigs that you see on Prince Edward Island farms, which has been, as I understand it, transformed over the past few centuries by crossbreeding with quick fattening Oriental pigs. I see some experts here. I don't know if that's right or not, but that's what the book tells me. As perhaps happens to some modern farms, pigs were treated more carefully than many other animals. There were penalties in law if one disturbed a sow during the first several weeks of the litter. They were to be left totally alone, and they were left in something cave-like. I don't know exactly what it was, but they had a special place for them. And I think this is something many of you will remember. The runt of the litter was often taken by the farm wife and hand-fed. And she didn't do this without some benefits. The law provided that in the event of a divorce, she was entitled to 2/3 of the meat of the pig that she had brought into, that she had hand-fed and hand-raised. So you can imagine the interference almost, but the law covered every little aspect of farming. And because pigs, of course, will eat many things, anything, they will eat acorn, grass, leaves, roots, they're prone to trespass and wander around unless they're enclosed. And as a consequence, the law texts treat pigs and consider that their trespass should have as particularly troublesome, and that it was a more serious offense for a pig to get on a neighbor farmer's land than it was any other animal, and the fine was higher. A pig was also, of course, the source of lard for the Celtic larder. Measure of importance of the pig to the Celtic society can be reflected in it not being used as a measure of value, as were the cattle and sheep. The value of a pig however, was about comparable to that of a sheep. Because of time constraints, I'm going to gloss over the remaining animals. Hens were very important, as can be concluded by their inclusion in the currency system, so to speak, with sheep and cattle. Such was not the case with geese and ducks, which were also domesticated by the Celts. Although geese are rarely mentioned in the old texts, there is comment in the texts about their eggs, which apparently was prized more than those of hens. Both geese and ducks were hunted in the wild as well by Celtic peoples of this period. One aspect of Celtic farming that was different from the farming culture of Prince Edward Island of years ago was the beekeeping. I know that there's some beekeeping in Prince Edward Island and other farming culture, but the honeybee was of considerable importance to the early Celtic society because it was the main source of sweetening in the absence, of course, of sugar and other products we're so familiar with. The importance is demonstrated by the existence of a very special law text from that period, which has survived intact, and which the title of which is translated to beekeeping. And I won't attempt to harm your ears by trying to use the Gaelic words, beshbaha, I think, something of that nature. But anyway, for those interested in the subject of beekeeping, I'm telling you, it's just a fascinating textbook, and you can get it, I think, through almost any library source in the Maritime. There are copies at St. Avex and copies at St. Mary's and so on, and they have comparable interrelated library facilities, and there may even be a copy of UPEI, I don't know. Honeybee collection occurred long before the Christian era, and there's some evidence that the Celts themselves brought the honeybee into Ireland. The early Irish lawyers, and Brian, they'd be marvelous people to know because they devised an ingenious set of rules on beekeeping, as they did on all of the animal husbandry. The original, here's one, and it's a little complex, but it's fascinating. An original, if a swarm belonging to one beekeeper goes in a neighbor's property, then, this set of rules helps develop a system so that everybody in the community will end up with a swarm of bees. And I still have trouble getting it straight. And if bees go on somebody's property, there's a law of trespass. It's called, grazing trespass. In other words, bees are grazing like cattle on somebody else's property, and that's an offense. But The system works, as I understand it, like this. If one person has a beekeeping in a community, the original beekeeper has 3 years in which he can commit bee trespass or grazing trespass without any fine on his neighbor's properties. But on the 4th year, then the first swarm that comes out of that beehive must go to the farmer, that is, or the nearest landowner on whose property the bees have been doing the grazing. So then the neighbor then has a beehive. And this would continue until all members of the kin and beyond had their own swarms of bees. And this strikes me as an exceptional method of avoiding community conflict and jealousy, as all members knew that eventually they would get their swarm of bees. This same textbook on bees outlines a number of legal intricacies connected with the proclivity of bees to swarm, that is, to move from place to place, moving from farm to farm. For example, if a swarm goes on a neighbor's property and settles temporarily, the law allows the farmer who owns the swarm to trespass without illegality and recover his swarm. And it even spells out the manner in which he's to recover it. However, the person, the farmer on whose property he landed, is entitled to 1/3 of the honey of that swarm for 1 year. So everybody's compensated. However, if the swarm is permanently established, that is, if it can't be removed without destroying some of the property of the neighboring farmer, they have another method of dealing with it. It can't be removed. It must be left there. But the owner of the swarm gets 1/2 of the honey for 3 years of that swarm. And after that, it remains in the ownership of the farmer where it wandered to. You can see some logic, I think, developing out of these community rules, which became legal rules. And honey was a multi-use product for the Celts. It was used to flavor, of course, many things, from baked bread. It was food, of course, in its own right. It was used to flavor water and to make mead. Mead is made essentially from honey, and I think it's considered perhaps the earliest intoxicant made by man. The early Celtic farm also had cats and dogs. The former was probably introduced from Roman Britain. It wasn't native to Ireland. The cat was a household pet, understandably, and as well it performed its normal function as a mouse catcher. Dog was a little more useful. Dog was used for guarding, hunting, herding. The famous Irish wolfhound, originally bred for hunting wolves, was domesticated further and was apparently, it served all of these purposes. The old Irish law texts proclaimed penalties for killing and stealing these animals. Crops were interesting. Cereals were the major food source of the early Irish economy. A bushel of grain was used as a form of currency. That's a signal that it is a most important product, and also widespread, of course. The 7 cereal grains mentioned in an 8th century law text, apparently in an order of importance, and you'll recognize most of these. First, bread wheat. Second, rye. Third, spelt wheat. Then 2 types of barley. I think they're called 3-row barley and 6-row barley. I could never see somebody nodding and recognizes that. And then emmer wheat, and finally oats. So that order relates to the prestige accorded to cereal because it's equated as well with grades of the Celtic society. For example, wheat was the entitlement of a king or a chief poet, but the people below that normally had to eat products made of oat and not of this wheat. Of course, because the cereals were so important, it was difficult because of Irish climate to deal with wheats, and we would understand that as island farmers, I'm sure, would. But even Ireland was even damper than Prince Edward Island by climate. Rye, however, was a hearty winter cereal, and it could even be planted in the autumn of the year. Could be sowed, I should say, in the autumn of the year. There are samples of rye that have been found at Irish agricultural Bronze Age sites, and this proves that it was grown in Ireland before the Celts got there. The early texts go into great detail about the best soil for these crops, the best ways of harvesting, and the best manure for them. Now, I'll wait for question period for somebody to ask me what the best manure was. Well, better tell you, cattle and ox dung. There's considerable detailed information in the text, even on the method of reaping and threshing and drying, winnowing and storage of all of these cereals. There's reference to crop disease. There's one that uses the Celtic word glas, and I'm not sure I pronounced that, G-L-A-S. And according to the authors, it implies a color, gray or green color. And the modern writers believe that this is a reference to mildew or rust because of the use of a color word. And this is a likely interpretation considering the damp Irish weather, which would make crops, and particularly cereals, perhaps more prey to fungal infections. A rotary quern was used to grind grain into meal so that it could be made into bread and porridge. The type of rotary grain that was used had been in existence for something like 2,000 or 3,000 years at the time without much change. And beer could be brewed from barley and malt. That will surprise many. And rumors has it that this still is a favorite intoxicant in Ireland. After the grass family, the pea family was the most important source of plant food. This added different types of peas and beans to their diet, and these were usually grown in an enclosed garden found on most prosperous farms, and that also is another familiar sight to many Prince Edward Island farms. One of these gardens the Celtic gardens might contain some vegetables, herbs for health purposes, and flowers. And the vegetables, according to the archaeological studies and so on, appear to be onions, celery, leek, cabbage, and chives. The availability of fruit was very limited in the old Celtic societies. There was an indigenous apple tree, but it produced a very small, very sour apple. Sometime before the Christian era, they introduced a sweeter type of apple, probably from Britain. There is some evidence of a plum, but there's very little evidence of any other fruit that might have been in their diet. The plants, of course, we use for dyeing clothes, the cotton, the wool, and this was somewhat significant in the society because rank was sometimes indicated by the color of the clothes that you wore. A commoner wore, according to the text, a commoner wore yellow, dun colors, black and white. Sons of lords wore red, gray, and brown, and kings wore purple and blue. So I've worn my blue suit tonight, just mislead you. The text suggests, however, that these rules were not universally obeyed, and one would expect that, I think. The Celts, in general, were a male-dominated society and were, by some historians, considered still a warrior society. They had to be a warrior society moving across Europe, and the cattle thieving and so on, and also some history and legends of battles suggested they still retained a warrior culture. In most situations, women were dependent upon fathers or husbands for the approval of legal actions, such as contracts. Some authors on Celtic society claim that women had a comparatively high degree of power and freedom compared to other cultures of the same era, but that doesn't appear to be consistency on this. But the texts do indicate that although the power or authority or ability of women were somewhat restricted in the early society, they did have rights. The rights of women as spouses and their children were affected by the nature of their marriage or their union. Not all of them would be classified as marriages in our culture, but that affected the rights often of the women involved in them. Some of you might recall my last visit, which someone shocked me tonight by saying was 7 years ago, where I talked about all of the different categories of divorces and grounds for divorce and role of women and so on. Time certainly flies too quickly. I suggest that tonight the time and my subject topic doesn't really allow me to revisit that in-depth discourse. However, I would note that polygamy did exist in limited forms, because even the briefest form of union, what we would perhaps call a one-night stand, if it gave rise to children, that child would have an equal right with the first son of the highest form of marriage. And the concept of bastardy was practically non-existent among the Celts. For example, if a man had a wife, as I say, in the highest form of marriage, and the translation of the text is that he visits another woman, that with her consent, that the son of both unions would have equal rights of inheritance, but the mothers still would not have equal status. None of you will remember, but there were 7 forms of marriage. The highest 3, there were formal marriages, usually approved by the kin. Usually the parties brought some wealth or product, assets into the marriage. And the other 4 were more informal unions and were of a different classification, or general classification. One informal union, which we might classify as concubinage, would be considered in law as one of looser than the senior form. However, a concubine did not have to be under the control of the father of her child. She could choose from among her father or the kin itself, or even a son, to enforce contracts and validate contracts for her. Divorce was made fun of the wife in public was grounds for divorce. Another was that if he told tales out of the home about their sexual relationship, grounds for divorce. If a man leaves his wife, repudiates her, and goes to another woman, then she's free to stay on in the house for as long as she wishes. The laws also allowed the parties to separate by mutual agreement without penalty. The amount of bride price, something similar to a dowry, often depended on the social status of the parties. The couple contemplating marriage were expected to be of equal rank, as they used to be in our culture, but it wasn't a necessity. The financial burden often fell on the one who was the lower rank, and I had trouble defining what that exactly meant in practice. And I think it means something like if a prospective father-in-law of lower rank might pay a higher amount of bride price than one of the same rank as the bride who was a noble. A wife could inherit a share of her father's personal property. If there were no sons, she could inherit all of the property. She could pledge security and claim a fine of interest. An interesting aspect of these laws on polygamy, marriage, and divorce is that some of them appeared to have been winked at by the clergy when they first came to Ireland, and actually for some centuries perhaps. In one of the texts, and which presumably had to be written by clergy, it states as follows when it discusses the relationships between the Celts, the marriage relationships and union relationships between the Celts. It's looking for some justification for these practices to continue. And this is the quote from the Old Irish text. It says, "There is a dispute in Irish law as to which is the more proper, whether many sexual unions or a single one. For the chosen people of God lived in a plurality of unions, so that it is not easier to condemn it than to praise it." And that sounds as though they're waffling there a bit, if I understand the analysis correctly. Of course, when Christianity arrived, St. Patrick placed great emphasis on the conversion of women, particularly those in high status and royalty. Many of them were consecrated as nuns, you'll recall, and founded monasteries. And remember the consecration of Bridget, who apparently was a slave. So rank wasn't the only involvement for the status under Christianity. I should note that some pre-Christian Druids were women and were highly respected in that role, usually as physicians and people of wisdom in the kingdom. There are references in the law texts as women as poets, writes, and as physicians. And there were also, as I say, women Druids. I would note that it took about 20 years for a Druid to study all of the Druid canons, a little more than even our preparation for medicine these days, and certainly law. The Druids were more than religious priests. They were the philosophers, they were the natural scientists. They had achieved a very high level of science, and they were the keepers of the law and the teachers, and they were interpreters of the law as well. The coming of Christianity obviously had a significant effect on the Celtic society. It was a gradual effect, as you'll see from the religious reaction or quotation I've given to you. It probably had a positive and a negative impact on the culture. That subject in itself would be a lengthy and interesting inquiry, but I assure you that I have no intention of pursuing it tonight. The next persons you'd of course find are children on the Irish farm. They participated fully in the farming function. The text had very little concern with the internal affairs of the family. The rearing of children was a matter not only for the family, but of course there was the supervision of the kin in case children were not treated properly. So the law texts don't deal with them to any great extent. 14 was the age under which children had no legal rights nor any legal responsibility. Between 14 and 20, they gradually usually achieve some minor levels of legal rights, including land ownership at the older age. Our texts divide them considerably, and I won't review that to any great extent. One of the texts deals with the sick maintenance of children, and it provides in great detail that if a child is sick, what care they should get, what food they should get. And someone must take care of them. And as I say, it's enormous detail. Both parents were responsible for all aspects of rearing the children. If a child was conceived through wrongdoing of the father, he alone was responsible for the rearing of the child, even if the mother was a slave or was married to some other man. Some might argue that attitude of over 1,000 years ago was in some degree perhaps less barbaric than even our modern domestic state of law. If a mother became ill, she could require the father to assume full responsibility for the child's welfare. If the mother died, the father must assume full responsibility for the child. So it would appear, I think, from all of the text material that Celts took great care to ensure that someone was responsible for every child, regardless of the circumstances of its birth or the circumstances of their parents, whether their parents were ill or alive or not. The lowest people in the totem pole were the slaves and captives. And before concluding, let me give you a brief discussion of them. They were, as I say, the lowest rung in a very stratified Celtic society. People became slaves if they were a prisoner of war, or they were taken into Ireland by slave traders. A Celt could also become a slave if they didn't satisfy a debt. And as I understand the text, it had to be a fairly serious debt, and this was not often executed. A captive was without legal capacity, as was a slave. They were very alike. Their legal treatment of them was very alike. They both worked, usually on the farms. They were subject to all the laws, but enjoyed none of them, in other words. It appears that they had very little protection. The slave on the farm did most of the menial work, and they were very important important element in the farming process. Did chopping of wood, maintaining the domestic animals. Female slaves could be found at the querns and the kneading slab and other domestic tasks such as milking and churning. The sentence for murder was death or slavery, and the choice, of course, was a fairly easy one, and that added to the slave population. However, a captive could be freed if a person traded a slave for the captive. There was a little quirk in their law that gave a captive an out. I think Patrick's escape wasn't a trade. I think it was a pure escape. Patrick, as you know, was a captive from the island of Britain. He learned the Celtic language as a herder with the Celts, and St. Bridget apparently was the daughter of a slave, and she was another who gained her freedom and stature during the Christian period. Although the Christianity seems to have improved the status of slave to some extent, still the institution of slavery survived in Ireland at least until the 12th century. Now, that basically is the material I wanted to cover, and I think I may have taken up my time. But my introducer here, who asked me to do this, brought up the subject of fosterage with me. And I separated that material. There are a few notes I have on fosterage because I didn't want to prey on your patience too much. But if you're willing, I'll take less than 5 minutes perhaps to cover fosterage. No one's getting up. It wasn't perhaps a totally unique, but it was a very unique, fairly, how can you, degrees of uniqueness, excuse me, but it was a relatively not a frequent system found in many cultures. It was a very well-developed fostering of children, one totally alike our common concept of children being placed in foster homes. It was quite common among the old Irish Celts for a child to be sent away from home to be fostered while still very young. One of the old Irish texts refers to a foster brother and the foster child being reared in the same cradle of the fostering family. One very interesting aspect of fostering, to show its importance in this culture, is the nature, it can be gleaned from language. As you know from English language cultures, most children use an intimate form of expression for a parent, such as mom or mum or mummy or dad or daddy. When you're referring to a parent, almost all of us have that experience. The old Irish word, spelled M-U-I-M-M-E, and as I understand it, pronounced mummy, is not used for the mother, but rather the foster mother. So it gives us an indication of the association when there is a fosterage of the unity of the families. The old Irish word for dad, by the way, is pronounced dadan, as I understand it. And this is a word, of course, very close to dad or daddy. And one of the leading Irish scholars on old Celtic law and culture, Fergus Kelly, not a cousin Jim, expressed the opinion that, quote, if fosterage was not common or important in early Irish society, this shift of meaning would never have occurred. Now, there were two types of fosterage, one of affection, and for which no fees are paid, and one fosterage for a fee, for which set fees are paid to the foster family. The fee for the son of a king was 30 sets. I'm not sure again of the pronunciation, but the spelling is sets. The value of the set varies, but I think through part of this period it's about the equivalent of one milch cow. The fee for a daughter of that farmer was 4 sets. No reason I can find for this disparity, that is 4 for daughters and 1 for boys. Perhaps we could speculate that they simply believed the daughter to be more important, but our speculation could also be that the daughter was more troublesome or expensive to care for. A child in fosterage must be raised in accordance with the rank of the parents. So sometimes this could be fairly expensive, and the texts are so thorough, they spell exactly the quantity and the type of foods that must be fed to the children, and the different things that they must learn while they're in the fosterage. King's sons were taught board games, swimming, marksmanship, horsemanship. The noble daughter was taught the duties of running a noble home or a kingly home, and skills like sewing, cloth cutting, embroidery. The lower scale child, or the child of a farmer, had to be taught to care for domestic animals and all related farming skills. The fosterage arrangement was a contractual one. It was very formal on the fee fosterage, and less formal, of course, on the affection fosterage, because already you would anticipate on affection fosterage that there was some form of a relationship between the parties, or they wanted to create a close relationship. Fosterage created bonds between families, created bonds between children, and it also was a significant political factor for creating bonds between kin and, of course, between even kingdoms. Some boys and girls in fosterage received specialized training in areas considered very highly by the culture. For example, in medicine, in various crafts such as metalcraft or poetry, a son might be fostered to a master in that particular skill, so that they would learn from the best, so to speak. And girls would also, some girls were entered these similar professions in the same way, by way of fosterage. And as I say, there were references about in the Old Text about women as physicians and as wrights and other trades and as druids. So that basically covers fosterage in a very brief way. I want to thank you very much for the invitation to be here. The suggestion is if you have patience that we ask if there's any question or if you have any comments. I want to first tell you that I have no mastery of this field and just a normal historical, I guess, interest in it. So, is there any questions? Yes, sir.
When you gave your lecture the last time, 7 years ago, I believe it was the Graham laws
right.
that you covered for your extensively. Do these laws, were they in effect during this period of the Celts?
Yes, they were.
And this is, when
they come from the same sources.
Yeah.
The Old Irish texts, which were written by the Christians particularly in their earlier years, when they knew the Celtic culture completely. And I emphasize that I don't think this culture changes much in 100 years, or perhaps even 200 years. Very slow to change. It's only by some farming improvements might come from elsewhere. And as you know, Ireland was a very fairly isolated island, even from the British island. Although they were taking slaves from there and hiring armies to them and things of that nature, they had a limited trade. The major trade really started, I understand, in any significant way after Christianity, when the major monasteries became wealth centers, so to speak. And the abbots were most of them very efficient wealth managers. And they, of course, then had contact with abbeys and monasteries elsewhere in the British Isles. And I think that helped the growth of trade significantly. One question here.
What is your definition of a
There's many arguments among the scholars on that, and I think the best one, and the only one we can use, I think, is a Celt is a person who spoke the Celtic language. It's probably the most efficient way of defining a Celt. because there's remnants of Celtic language in almost every European language, because they lived in those regions. They lived, of course, in France. The part of France, Brittany, still had a Celtic language alive and well during the First World War, for example. It was said that Clemenceau, speaking with the British Prime Minister, who was from Wales, somebody help me here for a moment. Who? Lloyd George, exactly, Lloyd George. Senior moment here. That they spoke to each other because they both spoke the Celtic language, although it was different variant, somewhat different. But that's what the scholars say, because the Celts came in streams or in tribes into Europe. About 1000 BC they started, I think, something like that. And then they flowed across Europe and settled in various places. There were Celtic establishments in Turkey. St. Paul wrote to the Galatians, Gauls. The word Gaul and the word Celt was interchangeable according to some of the Roman writers, including Caesar. And it was the source of... So I think that's the best definition as far as I'm concerned, and I'm not a great historian at all. Yes?
Two very short questions and then one kind of broad, and go through the quicker ones first.
Okay.
The audience. In the Brehon laws, did you find anything referring to the practice of cattle raiding for wrestling?
Oh, yes.
Legal justification for it. That is, when it's right to do and when it's not right to do.
No, I didn't investigate it that thoroughly. You mean when it's right to do under the law?
Yes.
No, I didn't investigate it that thoroughly.
Terms of right.
Well, there certainly was, if it was against the law, there was a penalty. There was a penalty for even the most minor things. So it's almost inconceivable there wouldn't be one, although the enforcement of the penalty would have to be done probably by a high king or something of that nature. And it becomes political, one would suspect then.
Yes. I think well, it's something that kind of overlaps culturally with a lot of the sort of layers of what we're talking about, structures and authority and so on. But it's just kind of one thing that piques my curiosity because, it's become part of our culture, not at present so much, but even on this little island, it was quite a common practice in the original life.
Cattle raiding?
Yes.
Interesting.
And still happens occasionally today. Cultural roots, you might say. And in the divorce rules, you talked about the fat couple,
Not the fat couple, the fat husband. The fat husband.
No longer could be a husband in one way, I guess. The loose-lipped husband, the teller bedroom tales outside the home. Now, was there a parallel restriction on the wife, I'm wondering?
Not that I'm aware of.
Share her little secrets with her friends.
Not that I'm aware of. There isn't today. I don't see why there would have been then.
Then we're a little closer to the bigger picture, which someone has already talked about. What is a Celt? Have you had time yourself to look very much at the difference between Irish, Gaelic, Celtic culture and sort of the northern quarter, like in Western Europe, the Bretons and such people, to see perhaps where the differences have their roots, if you like?
No, I'm not that much of a scholar, but there are two chains of language, and the scholars are generally follow those chains. The language of the Irish Celts is different than the language of the Welsh Celts. But of course, the Scots Celts, the language is similar because part of the immigration into Scotland was from Ireland.
Right.
And I think the Celts in Brittany is similar to the Welsh, and the Celts from the Isle of Man is similar to the Irish Celt tongue. There's two basic tongues, Q tongue and P tongue, I think it's called.
That's right. And from what I've been able to read, although it's a very cloudy area of history, the difference in my mind and that of others seems to be due to the influence of the Phoenicians under Milesius. father of Niall and Scott, his wife, whose name is in Scotland after Niall conquered the west of it and drove the Scots and picked up into the Highlands and Highlands. So it's about the time you're speaking of, and the languages begin to diverge. And you see with Meletius and the Phoenicians what seems to me to be the influences that begin to distinguish Irish Celtic culture. And I think most of them are Egyptian, because the Phoenicians were more or less Egyptian. They came from northern Egypt, the eastern Mediterranean, Jordan, that area, and roughly between the Romans and the Christians, if you like, into Ireland. And brought with them some things that the Egyptians had as part of their culture. Viz, cats. I think cats go back before Romans. They come from or right around that time. The records indicate that Meletius made a voyage around the Iberian Peninsula and not into Hibernia, into Ireland, and did not really visit mainland Europe. So we don't find Meletian influence in northwestern Europe in Celtic culture. Besides, Catholics is perhaps the least powerful of the connections. There's beekeeping, which began in Egypt. There's, you say horse racing.
Can we check with some other people, see if there are other questions?
Sure.
And then come back.
It's a short list, and I just wanted to present it briefly for you to think about. I won't tie up too long, but certainly you can go.
We can come back to you
Sure.
If there are no other questions. Question here.
You said that a child born under circumstances where the father was at fault for some time, that he was responsible for the care of the child. I wonder if that means that he took the child into his home, or did he pay to the natural mother?
I think it would be both. As I understand it, it could be either one or the other. I think that the obligation is a personal obligation, and if you, for some reason, you can't fulfill it, then you pay a fine sufficient, or you pay for the care of. And the care, the amount that you pay is all spelled out, depending, again, on the age of the child, depending on the rank of the child, that type of thing, which would be the rank of the father normally. But there were no jails, there were no ways of punishment other than fining, or that was basically the basis of it. And everyone basically, was farming or doing some special chore for the state, for the king. There wasn't much other activity other than war. But the amazing part of it is the detail of the certainty of the child being cared for and well cared for. Just amazing. We don't really have it, I don't think, in our culture in the same way either.
Tracing those roots back to the migrations across Europe and so on, is there a single focal point for the Celts, or are there numerous? In other words, the font, if you will, from which all these peoples flow.
Well, they have an area, many of the historians have an area that they will call the homeland. But almost every one of these areas that are called homelands, somebody migrated from mid-Asia to, at one stage or another, the Germans followed the Celts and kept going before the Huns, and it went on for 1,000 years. But most of them all Indo-Europeans, and they originated originally in India and then out of Asia, usually the plains of Asia, onto Europe. And the Celts were the first in recorded history to enter Europe in that way. Pardon? No, not directly from India, from Asia, from Central Asia. But the area that was called the Celtic homeland, I'm not even sure geographically what country it would be now, but it's in the region of European Russia and Poland, and roughly that region. That was called their homeland, but it was I'm sure they were pushed there from somewhere else by someone else originally. But the language, the reason we use Indo is that the source of many of the European languages, with very few exceptions, come out of India. So they presume they follow people more and more expertly on a linguistic basis. And the Celtic language has an Indian base. Some of the language are words that are very similar to those that come out of India. There are very few places in Europe that don't have, the German tribes have that same base as well. And the Romans and Greeks, I believe, all had that same base. Which the Latins, I don't know where they came from, more isolated and smaller group. Yeah,
just in the way of a comment, like unconsidered items here, like you say that the fees not straying onto other people's property. At the annual school meetings in each district, we used to appoint a brief. They call them the cattle. Each settlement, like the loose cattle on the road, he was to take them, find them, and farmer that owned them would have to pay so much to get them out there, which I presume in the island many customs I remember as a young boy when we sheared the sheep in the spring, and of course they would put out in the field, and father always take red ochre and put it on the chest of the ram, and then a few days later, after you see the sheep out in the exercise to do, each one you could see a sheep, and her rump would be all red, even though she was bred. Amazingly, back in Ireland here the other year, they still use the red ochre there, and I was amazed to see there's up in the country road, hey, you see sheep out there, all these colors.
Practical common sense.
Yeah.
All of those things. And the fact, they had coloring like that, they made coloring and probably used it for that purpose.
Yeah.
There's lots of little things that you'll notice, those who come particularly from farming groups, but also, of course, the fence person they used to have appointed to decide on fence lines. You remember that? That used to be in the county laws and things of that nature. And they probably had somebody for that purpose, but in a different way. Celts.
You spoke of what would be known as common pasture. Then there would have to be some measure of, okay, how many of my sheep went into that pasture? Then obviously you want them back.
Yes.
They're progeny.
Yes.
And so presumably there would be set rules.
But there must have been. Again, it would be a practical answer, not one that I've read of, but it would probably be a common sense, practical way of tagging or marking. And of course, they would have, pretty qualified herders. It isn't just anyone who goes out and herds sheep and cattle and so on, but sheep particularly, one would think. They would be well trained and they would get to know their flock pretty well. And usually more than one, too.
They'd be bred before they put into the common pasture.
They often mark the cattle sheep.
Branding in a way.
Today, I think it's largely different colors. Because we've seen sheep in Ireland and they would have spray colors on them.
Next it will be chips. We'll all be wearing them. Murder. I think treason has always been. I'm not sure. Yes. It was a horrible penalty because they had a penalty where you would be outlawed, what we call outlawed, I guess, where you couldn't stay in your community, and I think there was another stage of penalty where you couldn't stay in any organized kin group. So we were starving to death practically, or you became in a thief or something to survive, or you went into the wilds to survive. There still was a fair amount of woodland in Ireland at that time. It wasn't all removed all at once.
Was there a form or a variety of forms of execution?
I don't think so. No.
So like capital punishment, that wasn't taking one's life.
Taking one's head, cap. Cate. Or become a slave. But I suspect that most of the people given the choice. What would you think? You just guess.
No, it is in the event that it was carried out.
Oh.
It was decapitation.
I believe so. People of the sword usually use that method.
They have a plow to work with, like made out of some kind of metal, or
That's a good question, and I didn't explore that. They did have plows of types when the advanced metal came, but even if you think of a bronze plow, how effective that might be, would have to be very, soil that would accept a bronze plow without bending or.
I thought you said that there's different firms here to plow.
Oh, a plowing operation. As I understood it, plowing operation required more than just a plow. It probably required a number of people to handle different pieces of equipment. I don't know actually how it was done. I'm covering the surface here pretty well, and it would be fascinating. They have written from the text on every aspect of this. There is in the text everything about plowing that you want to know, but I haven't read it. I just read that there was plowing, some brief overview, so to speak. But anything you wanted to know about it, and I'm very serious about raising bees, because I had a look at that text, and it's just mind-boggling the detail they go into. About how you collect bees. It just goes on and on. I didn't read all of that, and I don't know much about bees to start with. But if anybody could take that book today, I suggest, and start to raise bees and with that kind of thoughts. It's the same with almost everything. And can you just imagine for a moment, think that what we're doing here and what all of the scholars have done is take the law books and they tell you about the culture and the society, and the detail that they have is enormous. Can you imagine some alien coming in and picking up our law books, opening them up and trying to decide from those law books what our culture was like? I mean, even our good lawyers and our good judges sometimes can't decide what some of those laws mean, So just imagine the way that they had that level of, although it seems like an invasion, the more you read about it, it doesn't seem invasive. If everybody knows what they do when there's a problem, then they don't have to go outside of the group even. They might have to consult a druid or someone like that, but everybody roughly knew what these rules were, so they either didn't break them, or if they broke them, they had the power of the kin to say, most people in the kin would say this was wrong, the law says this. It isn't just two farmers debating, it's the kin. So I think it avoided and resolved problems at a very low level, and avoided problems because they had this detail of light to guide them. Now we are getting pretty long.
The fact that the people come here first with all woods, they all have the old stuff. And the lots of roots, the old stones, they put down and actually get roots stuff. That's the opposite theory. I don't know what kind of balance or what they got there for the stable.
That's right.
It's amazing what the president I got. With a set of books that and I came here last winter on every farm implement and everything that we do over. Like for a stump when they cut down a tree, and they would take and pass the chains and that on, and they would go over to a very large tree, and they had a very long wooden stake, and a bunch of men, when they would start climbing around the large tree, and they would pull that other stuff they just cut down later to the ground, and it was called a castle. Yeah, they had different places of like the capitals and that day. And it's just amazing that the powers that they had, you know.
They learned a lot of those techniques from sailors, and
Yeah.
the sailing ships, the big sailing ships,
Yeah.
how they maneuvered things on those ships, vast weights.
Yeah.
They learned those skills.
Yeah. Teamwork.
Any other questions? Gentleman back there, did you have another question?
Well,
Go ahead, Chip. So it's more than just the suit. It's
Okay,
a
last question back there.
fascinating little story, though, about the Turkish Celts. They were invited in originally, I think, they were hired as an army, some of the Celts, as they were moving across Europe, and they invited them in, and they loved the interior of Antola, the center of beautiful farmland, and they just stayed there. They couldn't leave. And they were there for quite a while. I guess the blood is still in many of the Turks. Now,
I said I'd come back to this gentleman. If you have one last question, then we'll close it down.
Well, my real question, I guess, is whether you agree with my thesis or not. I haven't laid it out in the full brief, so I'll ask you that. But I will ask you if you agree that the present laws fell apart, if you like, or failed in their authority because they were nepotistic.
because they what?
Were nepotistic, that is,
Oh.
inherited authority. Was
I don't.
inherited.
I think they. I don't know. I really don't know. I think that they survived. They survived for quite a while. Parts of them. Christianity changed dramatically. Some of them after a few centuries, and I think that probably was one of the major reasons for change. And then subsequent to that, when you get to the 10th century and the 11th and 12th century, you have the Vikings coming in, you have the Normans coming in, and many influences would change the Brehon laws. So I don't think they failed just for that purpose, because most of the culture of Europe was similar, if not the same or worse at the time.
So you don't agree that they were
I don't think so, no.
failed because of corruption, like
I don't know enough about it to answer with any authority.
Okay, I guess we'll call a halt to it now and thank our speaker. Obviously, this is a very, very interesting topic area, and just by the questions that we've got here this evening, we've got no questions on this lecture or been any before this. And as you indicated yourself, it's an area that we just touched the surface of. And I have to say again, as I did 7 or 8 years ago, we'll have to come back and focus in on a more narrow area in the future, and I guess explore this whole area for us, because I don't know, as Irish, Scottish Celts, we can't seem to get enough of this. We are interested in our past and where we came from, what we're all about. And thank you for coming over and illuminating this aspect of it here tonight.
Delight to be here. very much.
As usual, we're not in a hurry to chase you out. We have a bit of a lunch, and feel free to stay around and talk to our speaker. If you have some questions you want to speak in one-on-one, socialize, and have a cup of tea or coffee, and enjoy the rest of the evening. Thanks
very much.
Conversion.